So good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture Crop Talk webinar. If you have any questions during the presentation today, please type them into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer them as they come. If we don't get to the question today, we'll certainly send you via email. This webinar is being recorded, and we will send a link out to the recording at the end of the day. And again, we're using a new platform this year for Crop Talk. So if we have any issues, please just send me an email and I can manage those issues with you. And again, Q&A tab at the bottom for any questions. And go ahead, Lionel, you can take it away.
Thanks, Lori. I'd like to welcome everybody to the February 1st edition of Crop Talk. We are going to be doing four, I guess we can call them winter issues of Crop Talk before we get into the full-fledged spring planting season. So it'll be one today, February 1st. The next one will be on the 15th, and then March 1st and March 15th. So those are the days that we'll be looking at coming to you with Crop Talk. As Lori mentioned, we are doing a little bit of different this year with Zoom, so hopefully we're not going to run into too many problems, and if we do, I guess just be patient, and we'll work through all the kinks as we get going through the season here. For today, excuse me, for today, I'd like to welcome Allison Sass. She's going to be giving us a weather update, which I think is kind of fitting from what we've been going through for the last month and a half here. And I think Allison's going to talk about kind of what happened last year and what we can maybe expect for this coming season. I've already had a couple questions come in, so there'll be some questions after she's done. Then we've got some questions that have come up since Ag Days. Some of them were things that we had discussed, but producers had wanted a little bit more information on some of the answers that were given. So we're going to try to do a few of those things today. Some of our panelists are doing live meetings today. There's a couple going on, so we're not going to have our full panel today, but I kind of picked out the questions that I think we'll have members of the panel on to help discuss some of the things that came up. So with that, I think we're going to turn the screen over to Allison, and we're going to get our yearly weather updates.
Thanks, Lionel. Okay. I have lots of options to share my screen here, so I'm hoping I pick the right one. How is that looking?
Looks great.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks again for the introduction, Lionel. I'm Allison Sass, and I'm the Agricultural Meteorology Specialist here with Manitoba Agriculture. And as Lionel mentioned, today I'm just going to give you a brief little weather update. We'll go over some of the conditions that we saw in fall in terms of fall soil moisture, and then we'll go through some of the winter predictions that we heard from the weather specialists, and what we've seen so far for the winter, and what we can expect to see this spring. So here's an outline of what we'll be covering. So I'll start with a review of the soil moisture from 2022. Then we'll move into the winter events that we've seen in Manitoba, and I'll touch on some of the events that we've seen in the US as well that might impact some of our decisions in Manitoba. And then I'll end up with some discussion on the spring predictions and an update on what the Ag Weather Program is going to be up to this growing season. We can start by looking at the fall soil moisture conditions to give an indication of what the seedbed conditions were at freeze up. Please keep in mind that there are still a lot of factors that can greatly impact the amount of water available to plants in spring. So this is just kind of a preliminary idea. And also keep in mind that these are very regional perspectives of the soil moisture, and it doesn't represent field by field conditions. We only measure soil moisture up until the fall because the freeze and thaw doesn't give a good indication of what's happening. So we basically stop when the ground freezes, and then we start observing again in the spring when the majority of our stations have thawed out at the 30-centimeter depth. So this first map is looking at the soil moisture at the fall of 2022 at the 0 to 30-centimeter depth. And it's showing the amount of available moisture in millimeters. So we can see that most regions in Agro-Manitoba have moisture in the 25 to 50 millimeters and the 50 to 75 millimeters of available moisture levels. So that's the most part. There are some regions of the Northwest that are showing less than 25 millimeters of available moisture in the 0 to 30-centimeter depth. Moving to the root zone depth, so the 0 to 120-centimeter depth, a similar trend can be seen. The majority of central, eastern, and the interlake have 150 to 225 millimeters and 225 to 300 millimeters of available moisture. Large areas of the southwest and northwest are showing less than 150 millimeters of available moisture at the 0 to 120-centimeter depth. We can also look at the percent of available water holding capacity, which is it compares the volumetric moisture content at a given site to its available water holding capacity, which is the difference between permanent wilting point and field capacity of the soil. So the percent of water holding capacity at the 0 to 30-centimeter depth, we can see that the Northwest and parts of the central region are below the 60% available soil moisture. The interlake and the east are over 80% of the available water holding capacity. Looking at the 0 to 120-centimeter depth, we can see a similar trend as we saw with the 0 to 30-centimeter depth. The Northwest and a few other areas are showing below 60% available soil moisture, and the rest of the province most of it is over 80% of the available soil moisture. Looking at it in relative to field capacity, at October 30th, the 0 to 30-centimeter soil moisture was the majority of the western part of the province was optimal to dry, and the west and interlake were optimal to wet. Looking at the deeper root depth, on October 30th, we can see similar conditions with a large portion of the province optimal to wet. And so what does this tell us? All of these maps are indicating that we need more moisture to provide adequate moisture for seeding. But again, there's a lot of things that can change between now and planting and when we need those seeds to get water. So we'll move along to what we've seen this winter. I'll start with a couple of the predictions that the weather experts were showing up in the fall, so October and November. They were predicting near normal precipitation for Manitoba, as well as some colder temperatures on the prairie. So this is as a result of La Nina. So this is the third year that we've had La Nina, which often results in very cold temperatures across the prairies. They were expecting to see a few warmer periods. So we did see those probably a couple of weeks ago, at least in the Winnipeg region, where we had a nice little warm up before these frigid temperatures that we're experiencing now. But overall, the temperatures would probably be below normal throughout the whole season. There is a polar vortex playing a slight role. However, we're going to see that impacting Alberta and Saskatchewan probably more than Manitoba. And what that would do, if it does touch on any parts of Manitoba, would just result in a little bit even more colder temperatures. So what we've seen so far this winter kind of follows those predictions. So while winter is far from over, I should say, as we can feel right now, we can look at what we've experienced so far. So looking at the mean temperature differences that Manitoba has seen since November 1st, this map is illustrating the difference between the actual observed average temperatures compared to the 30-year average that's provided by Environment Canada. And we use the averages from 1979 to 2000 right now to get our, to compare to normal. So the temperatures are below the 30-year average in much of the southwest and northwest regions. So these light blue areas, whereas temperatures are slightly above the 30-year average in the central regions by about 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. Temperatures since November 1st are above average by 2 to 4 degrees Celsius in the Interlake and parts of the east. So a little variable from what the predictions were showing, in some of the in some regions. Looking at precipitation so far in Agro-Manitoba, we can start by looking at the total accumulated precipitation from November 1st to January 29th. The majority of Agro-Manitoba has a total accumulated precipitation values between 15 and 35 millimeters. There are a select few locations in the northwest and in the far east that have accumulated precipitation over 55 millimeters. The highest total precipitation we've observed so far since November 1st is at the Paw with 70 millimeters. When we compare that to the normal accumulated precipitation to the 30-year average, most regions, with the exception of a few locations in the northwest, have received below normal precipitation so far this winter. However, we all know that things can change quickly. As I mentioned earlier, we are hoping for some added precipitation before spring to provide adequate moisture for that seed bed. So I wanted to touch a little bit on some of the storms in the US. I'm sure if you've been following the news over the past couple of months, you've seen some pretty big weather events in the US. I'm going to focus on what's been happening in North Dakota and Minnesota, just because they have implications for flooding in the Red River Valley. And they definitely did have a few rain and snowstorms over the past few months. So according to NOAA, Grand Forks and Fargo have experienced well above normal precipitation. So in December alone, a grand total of 39.9 millimeters or 1.5 inches of liquid equivalent precipitation fell in Grand Forks in December alone, which is 22 millimeters above normal. And in Fargo, they received almost 50 millimeters of liquid precipitation just in December, which is 27 millimeters above normal. And for us perspective, remember that the majority of Manitoba has shown around 35 millimeters since November 1st. So North Dakota, Grand Forks, Fargo has received above normal precipitation, whereas most of Manitoba is receiving less than normal precipitation. However, as far as flood predictions are going, right now, the risk of significant flooding, so that's moderate to severe flooding, is relatively low, and this is as of a report they launched on January 26. However, we all know that late snowfall, spring precipitation, and timing of thaw can cause these predictions to change quickly. Manitoba hasn't released a flood outlook yet, but I do believe they usually release one in February. So here's a seasonal precipitation outlook for the US provided by NOAA. The precipitation values in the northern US can, like I mentioned before, impact flooding possibilities along the Red River Valley. So North Dakota and northern parts of Minnesota are showing a 33 to 40% probability that precipitation for February, March, and April might be above normal. So we'll move on to look at what some of the models and climate predictions are predicting for spring, focused more on Manitoba. So we'll look at the CANSIPS forecast, which uses two forecast models to create a climate forecast compared to the 1981 to 2010 normals. This first map shows the forecasted temperature anomalies for February, March, and April. And if you look closely, you can see that much of Agro-Manitoba is showing temperatures predicted to only be slightly normal by about approximately 0.25 to 0.5 degrees Celsius. And parts of the Southwest are predicted to show almost normal temperatures. Using the same CANSIPS forecasting model, we can examine the predicted mean monthly accumulated precipitation. This map model shows precipitation levels near normal for the months of February, March, and April for all regions in Manitoba. This is the mean monthly for a 3-month period. However, when we look at the month-by-month breakdowns, they all show near normal precipitation. So we don't expect one month to have above or below normal precipitation versus another month. They're all kind of the same. Looking at the Environment and Climate Change Canada forecast probabilities for temperature, parts of the Southwest and East are at a 40 to 50% probability of having temperatures below normal for the next 3 months. And the majority of Agro-Manitoba has a 50 to 60% probability of experiencing below normal temperatures for February, March, and April. There is a 30 to 40% chance, that the province will have near normal temperatures. As for precipitation, the ECCC forecast produced on January 31st is showing an equal probability of precipitation above or below normal for the whole province of Manitoba, meaning that there is the same likelihood of having either above normal precipitation or below precipitation. So basically, we don't really know. So we'll move on to a couple of Ag Weather Program updates. So we did install a few new stations in 2022. We installed at St. Labre, Inglo, Erickson, Jordan's Corner, Amaranth, and Asheville. And these new stations will be coming online in the spring on all of our web platforms. This growing season, we also continue to do continued maintenance. So we do maintain our stations at least twice a season, and we do calibration as well to ensure that our stations are running as accurately as possible. We're also working to gather some more information on soil characteristics at each location. We do have a proposal in to help with this. So the more information that we can collect at our exact sites where we're taking our measurements in terms of soil characteristics, the more accurate our models will be, and the more accurate the calculations. And we can add this information into other agronomic models as well. We're also working to provide a channel for data collection for the groundwater group this summer as they install piezometers at all of our stations, which is another method of measuring soil moisture. And we're also investigating possibilities to improve snow measurements. So snow measurements are extremely hard to measure accurately, and all weather networks, regardless of what technology and methods they use, find this very hard to do. So many groups use a variety of methods to complement one another. So we're actually looking into the possibility of adding another snow shield. So if you look at this picture of our station, the snow shield is kind of that fringe that surrounds our precipitation gauge. So we're going to try likely this year to add a second screen around that. And this will hopefully reduce any buildup on that initial closer shield, and hopefully provide slightly more accurate snow measurements. And with that, I will extend my thanks for joining us today. And you can always find our data live at these links below. So through our current weather viewer or by station. And I'd also like to thank our AgMet team that helps to keep the network running, including Ian Petkow, Timiojo, and Brian Wilson. And as always, you can join the conversation with Manitoba Agriculture through our social media, our website, and our general inquiries. So with that, I will return the screen over to
I got a couple questions for you, Allison.
Sure.
So maybe just hold on before you change screens. Actually, one of them that came in was regarding the last slide you were showing on how do you measure snowfall. So from looking at that picture, how does that actually work to measure snowfall? I think that's what they're wanting to know.
So what happens is we have the snow. This is our precipitation gauge. Can you see my cursor?
You bet, yeah.
Okay, so this is our precipitation gauge, and it's an all-weather gauge. So what happens is when snow falls into the gauge, there's like a funnel on top. It falls inside, and we actually have antifreeze in the gauge at the bottom, so the snow melts. So as far as measuring snow versus a tipping bucket gauge, which we also do have at our sites, we use that more as a backup. What happens in a tipping bucket gauge is the snow accumulates on top of the gauge, and then we have to wait for that snow to melt naturally in order to gauge any of that precipitation. So it just kind of freezes just like it would on top of a roof. So these ones are much more accurate than a tipping bucket gauge, which basically doesn't measure snow. And what makes measuring snow so difficult is wind. So this fringe around it, this shield, helps to reduce the wind directly around the snow gauge. And by adding a second shield that's a little wider, we're hoping to reduce that wind effect a little more. And it's tough with our stations as well, because we want our stations out in the open so that it's representative of what we see in a lot of agricultural settings, and that so we receive accurate wind speed readings for the growing season. So as a result, our snow gauges aren't sheltered. So again, snow is very relative. And we all know this even just from looking in our yards. There's spots where snow accumulates more in a sheltered area than in a non-sheltered area. So that's how we measure it. We use an Pluvio all-weather gauge to make stories short. And we also use, not in our reporting, but when there is a snow event, we look to see what conditions are in other areas as well. So we look to see Environment Canada measurements. There's also a community observing network called COCORAHS, and it's spelled COCORAHS. And that's a volunteer network across the whole country in the US where volunteers measure snow by melting it and using rulers as snow markers as well. So our measurements are based on the water equivalent that we collect in our pluvio gauge.
Okay, good. What is the soil or the moisture situation to the west?
I'll back up a couple of slides. As far as soil moisture, it's variable, so it tends to be more on the drier side. It depends on what part of the west you're looking for. So
I guess
northwest.
this question was more for like Saskatchewan, Alberta.
Oh, that I haven't actually had a chance to look at, but I could definitely follow up via email
Okay,
once I've had a chance to do a closer look on that.
okay. Are you needing any more new weather stations?
We are always looking for new locations to install. It does have to fit within our network plans. So ideally, every 30 kilometers is a good distance to have from station to station. I know we were looking for a location near Ashern. But if there's someone interested in hosting a weather station, they can always reach out to us and we can go from there in terms of if their site is appropriate and whether that's an area that we're looking to install.
Okay, and this question is from me. You probably heard a bunch of, or hear people talking about hoarfrost and rains later on. Do you believe in that, or the rumor I would always hear is hoarfrost and then there's rain 6 months later? So, what are your thoughts on that?
I would be cautious about that. Again, that's kind of outside my expertise with the hoarfrost and predicting when rain will come. But I'm not too sure. I wouldn't say anything either that way. I like to rely on the experts and the numbers.
Okay, that was a political way around the question, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, if it is, we're gonna have a fairly wet spring seeding season, I think, so.
Yeah, it's tough to say. So again, it's so hard to tell and forecast that far ahead. Even Environment Canada is like, well, we might have lots of rain or we might not have lots of rain. So it's really difficult to predict that far ahead.
Okay, and yeah, I think that is all the questions I have for you right now, but you can stay on for a few more minutes in case something else comes in?
Yep, sure, I can stay on.
Great, thanks, Allison. Thanks for that update, and hopefully we get a normal spring this year so we can get the crop in and then it can start raining after that. So
Yeah, I'll put my word in with the weather controllers here and see what we can work out.
sounds good. Okay, so now we're going to go into our excuse me, our crop scouting panel. And like I mentioned, we had a couple presentations at Ag Days that had most of the panel there, and if they weren't speaking on the panel, they were doing presentations even just on their own at different sessions. So it was a good opportunity to meet the panel and hear some of the stuff they have to say. But from that, we got a few questions that have come in, and the first one is going to be for Dennis Lang, and it's a soybean question. I was talking to a grower actually right at Ag Days, and he was looking at growing soybeans for the first time, and he said he got reading that he should be using granular inoculant, and he's got an older air seeder with double shoot, and he was just wondering if he can apply granular. And then he was also wondering about fan speed, if it's going to be a problem with putting granular and the seed on. So Dennis, if you can maybe give him your advice on getting his drill set for putting on or getting a good soybean crop started.
Yeah, no problem. So I guess the first thing, the reason I suggest using a granular along with the liquid as a first-time grower is you need those two different forms of inoculant. I think it's very beneficial. We've seen years where growers have just gone liquid on seed or liquid peat on seed, and it's a new field to soybeans, and that's where we see nodulation failure. It's not going to happen every year. It all depends a lot on growing conditions, but having the liquid on seed and granular, put down through that separate tank is going to be very beneficial for you, because it allows that granular inoculant to work a little bit later in the growing season. Now, if you've seeded canola before, you can seed granular inoculant. That's what most growers will do if they only have two tanks. They'll put their soybeans in the one tank, and they'll put the granular inoculant in the tank that they normally would have for canola seed. That way, you have the right rollers in there, and then you're able to get that rate down to that 5 to 6 pounds per acre range. So it is definitely doable and highly recommended for a first-time grower.
Okay, and any comments about fan speed? I know I didn't mention that to you, but
well, with fan speed, run your fan speed. A lot of times it depends on how big your air seeder is. If you're, let's say, a 30-foot air seeder, you might be able to get away with a little higher fan speed, in that 3,600 RPM, 3,800 RPM range. The bigger the air seeder, you might have to, bring it back a little bit, because you don't want to damage that seed. But long and short of it is, when you're running this, it's mostly the seed or the soybean seed that you want to make sure you have your fan speed is high enough. So I usually start somewhere in that 3,200 range and then kind of move up and from that point. And again, probably the biggest thing to be concerned with, you don't want to be running it at 4,500 RPMs and damaging that seed. Less than wheat, and so somewhere in that 3,200 to 3,600 pound range. And that should work okay for you. I would just keep an eye on it the first time, just to make sure you don't want to cut it back too much. If you cut it back under 3,000, what you'll end up doing is you'll end up plugging the machine, and that's not a good thing. Yeah, and with that being said, just as a comment for Allison, April 1st is what I have on my calendar for the first rain. So April Fool's Day, so we'll see what happens.
Good one, Dennis. And hey, does fan speed affect the granular and location with the seed? Are you going to get, if you've got a high fan speed, and is it going to make it bounce around more? Or
it's the same as canola, right? Because you're still,
okay,
you have to play around with your rate a little bit. And a lot of times, like where I've seen growers have real problems with your fan speed is when they cut it back. Well, if you cut it back too much, you're going to plug. If you go too high, what ends up happening is it's more the seed that gets damaged, of the soybean seed versus the inoculant, because the inoculant is fairly small. It's very small seed, so it just kind of flows through the system. But what ends up happening with the soybean seed is, if your manifolds, and again, depends on the type of system you have, but if you have kind of an older style manifold with cast iron or steel plates and don't have those like rubber padding inside, and you're having a high fan speed run through there, if that soybean seed is very dry, you could damage that seed. And what ends up happening is you create what are called bald heads. So you've damaged the main growing point, and those bald heads generally don't have a very good vigor to them. They'll just usually die off. Now, with that being said, I've seen growers go from, on soybean seed, 200,000 seeds that they planted, and only end up with 80,000 plants, because their fan speed was too high, plus the combination with dry seed. Seed moisture is a little bit better, then you can probably go a little higher on your fan speed, just in case, if you're worried about damage. If you wanted to try as a new grower, what you can try is take your very last hose off on your seeder tool and attach a big long stalk and duct tape it, and do about 100 feet, and collect that seed and put it into a small container of water, and then just have a visual look at what that seed looks like. If the seed is all intact, that's great. Then you're good. If the seed is, if you're starting to see that seed coat start to separate off a little bit, kind of do a percentage count, because if that percentage is over 10%, then you're going to have to cut your seeding and your rate back. But at the end of the day, if you're, a 30-foot air seeder, and you're running in that, 32 to 3,400 RPM range, you should be fine.
Okay, and I think one of his concerns was, can you damage the granular inoculant?
Not so much the granular inoculant. No, it's a small seed. I wouldn't worry about that. I'd be more concerned about the seed. That makes sense?
You bet. Great.
Okay, cool.
Thanks. Allison, a question has come in, and one of the questions is, what is the interval in timing for your stations for sending in updates?
In the winter, well, the weather stations send information to us every 15 minutes. And we update them on the website through our web tools in the winter during the off season, hourly. And during the growing season, we change that to 15 minutes. Our current condition page, which is the page that shows the big list of all of the stations with the temperature and precipitation and wind speed, that updates every hour regardless of season. But the maps with the dots on it updates every 15 minutes during the growing season, as well as if you go into an individual station, that updates every 15 minutes as well during the growing season. So we
Okay,
usually
so-
start that May 1st.
Yeah, so if somebody's wanting to use it for spraying and wind conditions in their location, basically every 15 minutes they could check up and it would give them updates.
Yes.
Perfect.
And I did look up a quick look up what I found so far as regards to soil moisture anyways in Saskatchewan and Alberta is it is very dry for most of Saskatchewan and Alberta, a little moister, so it's dry between or kind of along the Manitoba Saskatchewan border.
Okay, so kind of similar to what it's on the edge of our maps. And
Yes, yeah,
perfect, great, thanks for looking that up.
no problem.
Okay, and while I'm on this screen, when we were at Ag Days and the panel with Dennis, we also had Ann Kirk on, and one of the things that Ann was talking about, or we got talking about a bit, was growth regulators. And the question that came in after the talk was about the timing for application of the growth regulator, and can it be applied to oats?
Sure. Am I able to share a picture, Lionel? I'll try to just, oops.
Yes, you can just take over the screen
Okay.
and share. Yep. Oops, that's coming. If you want to put it in slideshow mode, that'd be great.
Okay, great. So
Perfect.
this is, so yes, plant growth regulators can be applied to oats, and the timing is the same, or the ideal application timing would be the same for oats, wheat, and barley. So for ideal timing, like it is a bit tricky to see the nodes and the inflorescence in the stem. So basically what you're looking at for the growth staging is generally it would be about like 4 to 6 leaves and a couple of tillers would be around the time when you would want to be thinking about applying a plant growth regulator. But the actual application timing is very important. So in order to actually know when the plant has reached the correct growth stage, which would be about the growth stage 31 to 32, is pulling plants, taking off the tillers and cutting open the main stem with a sharp knife so you don't squish the nodes and the inflorescence in the stem. So I pointed out in the pictures that what you're really looking at is the position of the nodes in the stem and how they move up the stem. So the first node, so before growth stage 31 would be, before growth stage 30 would be too early to apply. And at that point, all of the nodes are underground in the plant, so you wouldn't be able to see any of them. Once you pull plants and you reach growth stage 30, the first node would be, the the tillering node would be above ground, or the first node would be above ground. And at the beginning of ideal application timing, the first node is at least 1 centimeter away from the tillering node. And then so as the plant continues to grow, the nodes push further up away from the tillering node, and then the second node will start to develop. You can see that in the picture on the left-hand side that says growth stage 31, there is a node right under the inflorescence, but it's less than 2 centimeters above the first node. And then when we look at growth stage 32, which is kind of the end of the ideal application timing, or when you would still plant, or when you would still apply, but you wouldn't want to go any further, is when the second node is at least 2 centimeters away from that first node. So basically a plant hits the different growth stages, so growth stage 33, 34, etc., when that next node is at least 2 centimeters above the node before it. So you'd want to be looking, when this first node for sure is at least a centimeter away from the tillering node, would be the start of the ideal application timing, and then the end is when that second node is about 2 centimeters away from the first node. And the reason why this is important is because the plant growth regulators are inhibiting or preventing as much stem elongation as the plant ideally would have. So if you're putting it on too late, the stems have already elongated and the plant height has already increased. So while you can apply much later, you really, in order to have good efficacy and have the plant growth regulator actually work, you want to be getting it on fairly early. And
So it's a fair.
Stop sharing. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No, I was just gonna. Are you finished off what you were gonna say, Anne?
Oh, I was just gonna say I'll stop sharing my screen.
Okay, so it's a fairly tight window then between that first and second node.
Yeah, it's a fairly tight window, and it's something like you just want to make sure you're on top of it. It obviously depends on the growing conditions, how warm it is and how fast the plant is growing. But just making sure that you're out there fairly early to see when those nodes are actually coming up above, coming into the stem.
And too early is not good, right? You want to be, if anything, I guess, on the later side.
Well, yeah, if you're going too early, like if you're going before the nodes are actually in the stem, then you wouldn't be having good efficacy either. Like it wouldn't be stopping the growth of those. It wouldn't be preventing the internodes. It wouldn't be shortening the internode distance. So too early, so the plant growth regulators are inhibiting gibberellin biosynthesis, which is the hormone that increases the length of the stem. So until it's actually starting to be produced, then if you're applying it too early, that gibberellin isn't even being produced anyways, and you wouldn't be having any effect on the plant.
Okay, good. That's great. Thanks, Anne. Next question that actually has come up since Ag Days, and I got Dave Kaminsky on the line this morning as well. And the question is, commodity prices have come down a bit, and canola coverage and crop insurance prices are pretty good. So the producer is asking that in the past he's been told that there is lower disease risk to grow canola on canola instead of wheat canola rotation. So I asked David if he could maybe give us a few pointers on this one. So David, are you there?
I'm here, Lionel, if everybody can hear me.
You bet.
Great. I'd like to start addressing this question by saying it's always a bad idea to crowd your canola rotation. And the Canola Council would have strong words on this, not just for blackleg, but for clubroot and other residue and soil-borne diseases. Now, the question was, I think, about blackleg specifically, so I want to address that first. If producers or agronomists attended our summer crop diagnostic school at the U of M farm in Carmen, they would have heard an excellent demonstration by our oilseed specialist, Dane Fraze. Dane's on paternity leave right now, by the way. So what Dane was talking about was using the same variety over and over will select for the races that overcome the resistance that's built into the plants, the genetic resistance. There are many different, I'll call them races because that's a short, easy to understand word. Some call them pathotypes, but there's a population of blackleg out there. And new varieties, as they come out, they have resistance to some of those races, not necessarily all of them. Companies are now getting to the point where they're convinced that they're maybe confident enough to label their varieties with exactly what the variety is resistant to. Okay, so if you plant the same variety 2 years in a row, the resistance to the particular race can be overcome very quickly by genetic changes in the pathogens population. So always a bad idea to plant canola after canola. Now, I was thinking about this a little more, and it sounds like the producer is thinking, I grow canola 2 years out of 3, which again, I think is maybe a bad idea, or even canola wheat rotation, which is a 50% rotation. Actually, maybe the 2 out of 3 years is the worst. Diversify your crop rotation. Don't chase the dollars of the easy money because one commodity is good. Think about your whole farm. Now, a rationale for maybe planting canola 2 years in a row is to line up your rotation on your farm. Yesterday, I was traveling with our new agronomist in the central region, Callum Morrison, and he farms a little bit, has 2 fields that they want to line up as having a complementary rotation. And that means for 1 year planting canola 2 years in a row. Now there is a risk to it, but it's a known risk. And now I want to get to the thing that is known maybe about blackleg, and is the reason that you might escape infection from blackleg when you're planting immediately after canola rather than 2 years after canola. The fungus that causes blackleg, when there's that fungus growing on the residue, it takes about 18 months for that the resting structures, the spore producing structures to mature. So you get maximal spore production 18 months after your last crop. And that's really into the second year. Now, if you've done this practice a lot, you might have inoculum from neighboring fields that's going to cause just as big a deal with blackleg. So maximum spore production is in the second year. It tails off in the third year and the fourth year. That's why we really urge people to practice a conservative 1 in 4 year rotation. 1 in 3, perhaps, if you're going after those attractive prices. So I hope that's not too long.
No, actually,
Any
that's
any questions that generate?
well, we'll not right yet, but that's some really good points as to what there's a lot of other issues the guys should be watching besides just the dollars, like you said. So good. That's a good answer for that, Dave. Thanks.
Great.
We're getting up there in time, so I wanted to show a few more slides here before we finish off, and I'll maybe just do a quick check on questions. Looks like we're good there. The environmental farm plan, we're getting a lot of different programs coming out now, so producers can now do the environmental farm plan online. So if you're interested in being a first time doing your plan for the first time, you can do it online, or if you need to renew it, it's now online. So just go to the environmental farm plan and it'll take you right to the site that you need to go to. There's also some other programs that are out. The Canola Council has some programs out for producers, as well as some of the conservation districts. And so definitely start looking at those. There's some money there available to make some improvements on the farm and add some changes to the farm. So definitely don't go without checking into those. I mentioned at the beginning that we're going to be having crop talks from February 1st to 15th, March 1st and March 15th. And these are the links to register for that. And then also the link to register for the summer ones. And they'll start on April the 12th. And that's when we'll be starting our growing season crop talks. So if you want to register for those, there's the link to register for those as well. The staff, our crop extension specialists throughout Manitoba, and their contact information. And there's a lot of things happening right now, a lot of meetings going on right now. So give them a call, find out if there's some meetings going on in your area, and definitely attend them, because a lot of our panel members are presenting and giving out some really good information. Our livestock specialist contact information is there. We're going through a cold spell right now, so your cattle are needing and livestock needing a little extra feed. If you're trying to get through with some questionable feed, these people could definitely help you make a plan as to how to feed some of it. So don't be scared to give them a call and talk to them regarding anything to deal with livestock. Our MASC offices, we're getting closer and closer to spring, so we'll be needing to talk to them regarding our crop insurance and any other things that you're wanting to deal with them on. So definitely contact them if you have any questions about your cropping plans for this coming year. Hay listing, if anybody has got bales for sale, I see a lot of bales coming up on some of the social media sites for sale. I think this is a really good place to put hay for sale. If you've got some for sale, there's a lot of people, a lot of traffic going to this, whether you need hay to buy hay or you got hay for sale, definitely go to this site and get it on there, as we're getting, again, where more and more feed is starting to come up for sale. And questions, if you have questions to Lori or myself, there's our email addresses, and there's the Manitoba Ag email address and the 1-800 number. So if you got any concerns or questions, please check or give us a call, and we'll get back to you. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and see you in, I guess it'll be in 2 weeks, the 15th of February, where we'll be looking again at some of the emerging issues in looking at putting the crop in for this coming year. So thanks for attending, and see you then.